This is the second studio by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bourderonnet, who's sniffing her tea.
Well, no, but I put these lovely mugs in the dishwasher. I feel like they smell like dishwasher now, and it bothers me.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. But they feel cleaner.
Okay, good. And this week, despite that little aside, is not an after hours. It's the two of us, and we are going to talk about basically advice for students giving presentations. And some of this could be applicable for professionals for sure, or for anyone else. And we're basically going to talk about the things you shouldn't do. And the reason why we're doing this recording is that recently we were critics at a student presentation. The students all did very well, actually, in fact. So if any of those particular students are listening to this, don't feel bad. There's always room for improvement, right?
I was going to say, you can always do better.
So. You can always do better. Exactly. Hit us with the first point. What is one of the mistakes that students make when they're giving a presentation?
Well, this is being based on the latest review we've been to. So I would say, it's just kind of like the things that come to my head.
Sure.
But they could change. The first one I would say is that students have a tendency to assume that the people they're presenting to know what the project is about and know where it is.
The site.
Yeah. And if you're in a studio where everybody has the same, parcel of land in the same city, maybe like the third, fourth student doesn't have to reiterate that. Mm-hmm. Although I think you could say like a couple words about it, or maybe like something different that has not been said about the site, just to keep painting the picture of the place to the people who you're presenting to.
Yeah.
But a lot of them, they just kind of like go into the details of the project, which is great because it says they have a lot to say about that. Mm-hmm. But in a way, it's a little bit not immature, but maybe it is, because you start with the stuff you're most excited about rather than just laying the ground and then going into those things. Mm-hmm. So I think just stepping back, and a lot of them are nervous, so they just want to say the stuff they have to say about the project and get out. And I understand. Yeah. I totally understand.
Yeah.
But I think explaining, where is the site, what is the site and its criteria, and what is the project about?
Yeah.
Is it a commercial building? Is it a recreational building? Is it a house? Is it a multifamily? Mm-hmm. Is it a low-income multifamily, a condo? Like, you kind of have to give some of those very basic parameters of what the project is, just so the information that follows that makes more sense. A lot of the students we've seen, last week, for example, I had to work hard looking at the boards, trying to figure out, like, was it on this site? Was it because the class had two sites? Mm-hmm. And I had to try and figure out myself, looking at the boards, which site it was, which was not always clear from the graphics.
Sure. And
then try to understand which building was what on their site, So just basic information.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing because with presentations, you always want to start with a why question and then the how and the what. That's how you convince people into something. When you're conveying anything, even a story, that's how you market, that's how you sell, that's how you present, that's how you hook people. Because if the audience doesn't have an inkling or an understanding of the why, the deep motive, then we lose interest.
But you could start with the what and then the why and then the how.
But the little exception to that is what you're saying, which is there is some basic information that needs to be conveyed almost as a kind of preamble, as a kind of pretext to what's going to be said. So that way everyone's situated and we're not just confused. So I agree, like saying your name, a lot of students forget to say their name, but actually knowing who you are is a very important thing, always. So, saying your name, the site, and all the stuff you mentioned. And I think the other thing too is that when you are deep into a project, even if that project's only been lasting for a couple of weeks, but if you're deep into it, mentally, then it's really difficult to step outside of it. So it's easy to forget that everyone else that's not in the studio, in your space, in your mind, doesn't know all this information. Yeah. And that's a really big part of putting together a successful presentation to a jury, a panel of critics, to a client, to a publication, to anybody outside of your studio, is taking the time to kind of dissect and analyze all the stuff that you've learned about yourself and the project in its creation to then unpack it and then repackage it in a very specific way to convey it to other people. So, giving a presentation and assembling a presentation it's a whole process. It's a whole process you have to go through. And I think when you approach a presentation that way, that's when you start to realize, oh yeah, the audience doesn't know about this thing. They don't know the program as well as I do. I have to explain it to them, right? And you made another point too, which we can call the second mistake that a lot of students and even practicing architects make, is that they don't convey some of these, basic facts in their graphics. And so, one of the primary things you want to avoid when giving a presentation is confusion.
Yeah.
You don't want the audience to be confused. And I want to be clear, confusion is different from curiosity. Like in a good presentation, there will be moments where people are curious and they don't know what's next. That's not confusion. That's curiosity. Confusion is, wait, what are we talking about? Like you said, is this the house? Is this north? Is this, what? Because as you said, the critic or the audience ends up spending a lot of time and energy just trying to figure out that one basic question. For example, wait, where's the front door? And then you do this whole spiel about like the universe and the history of architecture and why this is revolutionizing things and the experience and the emotions and the light and da. Meanwhile, the other person on the other cross of the table or sitting in front of you, all they're thinking is, where's the door? And so you really, really want to avoid that, and having clear graphics that convey things in that manner is important. So like, sounds simple, but text, right? Street names, north arrows, diagrams that say this building is blue. It's colored blue, and it's blue because that's housing. And all the blue buildings are houses in this site plan. And all the red ones are community centers or whatever it's going to be. I think both of those are very simple things, but man, they are overlooked in 95% of the presentations. And I think it's those two things, if you were to do them, that automatically makes you within like the top 5th percentile of presenters. It just does. Because most people don't think about these things.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to basically, did you rehearse, did you prep for your presentation, or are you just winging it? Because if you did put some sort of outline for a presentation, like that should be point number 1 and 2, and if you haven't, then that's that. The other thing that I've noticed is that a lot of the students, actually the ones we saw, were trying really hard to use the boards on the wall as they were speaking.
I thought they did pretty good.
They were using a laser pointer to really try to use the board as a storyboard for their speech. I felt like some of them didn't as much, and it probably because the boards weren't as clear, or maybe the organization and the order of the different documents on them was not organized in a way that it was flowing as their speech was, which goes back to, practicing your speech and your presentation is also a way to decide what to put on the boards and where and how big things should be and how small things should be. So they kind of go hand in hand. Like it's the boards are really a storyboard of the story you're about to tell to the jury. And I think a lot of times people don't really think about it that way. It's more about what looks good. Or what I have ready and what I haven't finished maybe goes to the end. That's like the worst case scenario. Like you can tell the last board is a little light.
Maybe
you could have
How
made
come that board's so
smaller.
low and near the floor and off to the side? Don't worry about that board.
And also sometimes there is redundancy in the documents that are on the boards, and that also is something that you could clearly see if you've prepared your presentation verbally. You would see if you don't need to duplicate this information twice in 2 different ways, right? Maybe one of them would have been better, or maybe this one is actually not about this point I'm about to say, it's about another point, and really use them to their best.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'll also say that a common mistake is that students don't use the boards enough. Or because it's giving a presentation, whether it be boards, a Zoom call, a slideshow, whatever, it's always difficult. It's difficult. It's not easy. And, you want to be fluid. You want to feel like you're speaking very naturally. And sometimes to achieve that, I think we as presenters allow ourselves to kind of get lost with what we're saying, right?
Yeah.
And also, once you hit a good stride when you're talking, it's a comfort zone thing too. It's comfortable. I'm going to keep talking because one word is coming after the next, and I'm going, and soon I'll be done, and it's going to be easy. And so, in those cases, it's very common for whatever the person is saying to be split off from what's being presented at that moment, in a slideshow setting especially. So it's very easy to keep talking, and then suddenly look at the slide and you're like, oh, well, I've just skipped over 3 slides of information.
Yeah.
Or in the case of boards, I'm talking. And what you should be doing when you're talking is pointing to the things that you're talking about. Not always, because you do want to have variety. You want to have moments where you're talking directly to the critics or the audience, and you're staring at them. You're creating a very intense kind of relationship. And other times we're talking to the boards, or you're looking at the boards, so they understand that they should be looking at the boards too. Yeah. But I think it's very common for a lot of students to not use the boards enough and to just talk. And again, meanwhile, the audience is like, you're talking, but I understand the words you're saying, but I don't actually understand the ideas or how this applies to your project because I don't know what building you're talking about.
And that goes back to the correlation between the verbal presentation and the boards. Is that a lot of times, and we've seen that actually in that last review, there is a lot of wish list things that are being said, but there is nothing on the board that shows how that's being implemented.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And it's kind of, it's kind of an easy thing to say. Be like, oh yeah, it's part of my project, and then no, but actually it's not, because it's nowhere to be seen except in your head maybe. So that's also like why I think preparing the verbal presentation as you prepare the board just keeps you in check. Make sure that you're not like just spewing stuff to sound good, where actually that's never been part of the project, and it doesn't always have to be. It's okay. Yeah. But like don't start listing all the stuff that would make the project look good on paper if it's not there.
I think putting together a presentation, like the graphic portion of it, putting together the verbal presentation and designing the project, especially in a student setting, they're all kind of synonymous in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because in a student setting or a conceptual project setting, the project is not going to be built. So literally the only evidence of the project, like the project, is literally the presentation. That's it.
Yeah.
And I know that's like a difficult idea to grasp for younger designers, because it's like, well, no, the project is on my table. It's my sketches. It's my thoughts. No, it's not. The project is the final presentation. And if it's not up there, it does not exist in the world as an artifact. It does not exist. Your thoughts are not real. They don't count. The chicken scratches on your desk that you've left at your desk, they don't count either. It's everything that's on the wall and everything that you're saying. So thinking about those 3 as much tighter is a better way to do it, rather than I'm doing my work and then I have to present, so then I'll show some stuff and do some talking. Like, you don't want to divorce these too much, because then it leads to these problems in presentations. It also reminds me that I think it's maybe helpful if you think about giving a presentation more like you're a tour guide, and you have to paint a picture and tell a story. So you really don't want to ever have a moment where you're saying something, but it's not on the wall. So I think like one of the students, they were talking about this research they did about the culture of the place or something. I forget what it was. And I'm like, that's great, because first of all, a lot of students don't have their own take on the site, which you should, but they don't. But this person had it, but there's no visual evidence of it, right? Yeah. So it might sound silly, but if you have a neighborhood context and you've analyzed it, you say this neighborhood, they have this annual festival where there's a parade, and this parade is very important for certain reasons to them, and therefore is important to my project, right? Well, then guess what? You need to show us a picture or photo or multiple pictures of that parade. You need to show some kind of evidence of that thing. One, for the sake of storytelling, but it also allows the audience to digest and understand that part of the information much easier, because now we're getting it both visually and through the ears. And as well for you as the designer, as the architect, when you're working, you have that image up at your desk. It's a constant reminder of what it's doing for you. And maybe there's other ideas that will come from it if it's present. The mistake that a lot of students and architects make is they leave their ideas just to be ideas. You don't want to do that. You want to always have like physical and written evidence of all your ideas somewhere, keeping track, because that's how you can actually build upon them. If it stays conceptual in the metaverse in your mind, then it's really difficult to make progress unless you're, genius. Genius Frank Lloyd Wright.
Going back to, I think, using the board as a tool for a presentation, because as you mentioned, the presentation is very static. It's just things on the wall and one voice doing all the talk and people sitting and listening.
Yeah.
It's not very exciting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So being dynamic by showing things on the board, yourself, but also if you have a physical model, that's an incredible tool to make a presentation much more interactive and potentially save your presentation. If your project is not very good graphically on the board, but the model is really good, hey man, use that model, pass it around, pin it up on the wall, put some lights on there, do whatever, but make it make it the seducing thing of your presentation.
Yeah.
You spend enough time, it's there. It's not just there because it had to be done. It's there because you should use it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point too. I think another common error is that people don't know how to use physical models and boards at the same time, because they're two completely different mediums. So it's like either focus on the board or just the model, and very few architects are able to effectively present both.
Or use it as your site plan on your board, pin it up, and then rip it out of the wall and use it as a model later on in your speech. There is ways. You have study models, little disgusting models that you made with glue that are super dirty or whatever. You don't have sketches. Well, maybe they're the scale that they're good enough, pin them on the wall. Those are considered sketches too. You basically have to be as smart as possible with what you already have done, rather than creating a bunch of new content for the sake of a presentation. You could use the work you've done throughout the process of creating the project as being a portion of your presentation.
Yeah, that's interesting, because so the counter argument to that is, well, the presentation is meant to be a very final, polished scene.
Yeah.
Right. So therefore, you shouldn't be showing us this trashy thing that you did that you're not confident in, or that was been stored under your desk for a few months now. You should just show us the final thing, because you have to have your shit together. That's the purpose of this. And I think that's true. And I think the other way to approach a presentation, especially in an academic setting, is more like, I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm not trying to filter out all of the mess. I'm trying to learn, right? So, and to learn, I'm going to show you more stuff rather than less stuff.
Yeah.
So here is the sketch I did. I thought it was interesting. It didn't make it into the final design because I ran out of time, or I decided it wasn't worthwhile, but I'm still uncertain. So I wanted to show it just to see if you guys had any thoughts about it. Now, one could argue that those are two very different approaches, but I actually think you can have both at the same time, especially in an academic setting and even a professional setting, right? I think there are two goals of any presenter. One is to convince the audience of their ideas, and the other is to learn from the audience. And I think it is sort of a fallacy that we as a presenter, you can't do both at the same time.
Yeah.
I think you can do both at the same time. And so, kind of rephrasing what you said, I think another mistake is that students, it's a funny thing, a good percentage of the time, the most interesting part of a project is a thing that's least shown, or not even shown, or at least talked about, right? It's like they do this whole thing. We have, I don't know how many square feet of materials pinned up, a model and all that stuff. And there's one drawing off to the side that was done quickly or whatever. And it's like, what's this? This is the most interesting thing. Or in the speech part of the presentation, you did all this talking, but the most interesting part you went over very quickly, and you didn't spend any time on it. Let's talk about that instead.
Well, I think it goes back into, the way things are being taught in school and the way students are expected to succeed in school, which is to finish, which is to have a nicely wrapped up product, right? Rather than actually like being more of a learning process. When we have students who present things and they're telling me what it's going to be, they're selling me the thing, and I'm like, yeah, I appreciate that you're putting the convincing argument and tone and the speech together for me, but I'm also way older, I have experience, and I know you don't know as much. Like don't try to pretend that you know what it's going to be. You don't, and that's why you're still in school. That's okay. There is this tendency of trying to pretend to be someone,
right?
Especially during those final, semester presentation and project. Like you figured it all out. Like it's all,
right.
you understood it all, and I'm kind of like, but you didn't.
Right.
You still have a lot to learn. You still haven't figured it all out. So how about we talk more about that process? And maybe the things that you've discovered and maybe where you think the project can go, rather than being this finite, thing that is a clear thing in your head. But to me, it's like it's 100 levels lower than where it needs to be.
Sure.
So, there's kind of like a misalignment.
Yeah, but that's interesting. So there's a lot of stuff with that. I think first is...
Like, I'm not expecting them to know everything about the project that they're talking about. You and like what we've seen, for example, in that review, is that there is a very strong focus on sustainability. That was one of the criteria of the design of the project, and very important. And they had to read a book and learn about those different building methods and how to become sustainable, how this architecture can be sustainable, which is a very heavy topic and very complex and very technical.
Sure.
Which, it's more than just like looking at a diagram. No, it's actually very complex. And a lot of them, maybe just to show that they knew the topic, were just regurgitating terms and data and kind of like, honestly, just basic information about sustainability, but in a way that, while making it sound like absolutely perfect. And I'm like, well...
Perfect, or that they are...
That it's in their project. Like, they learn about the Trump wall, and it's on their building, therefore it's sustainable, can move on. And I'm like, well... Yeah, you probably have a rough idea of what a Trump wall is. You think it makes sense for your project, and it probably does, therefore it's sustainable. No, that's not enough.
Right.
And it's like, you don't have to give me all of the stats and all of the technical terms that describe the wall section of a Trump wall and how it works to convince me. Like, that's not, I don't want to hear that. I don't need to hear, I don't want to hear that, because first of all, it's extremely boring the way a student would talk about it, because they're trying to understand it and trying to explain it to someone else,
right?
Which is, very complicated. And also, they're probably not even understanding completely. And it's probably actually not right in the way they're explaining it.
Well, I think that really, for me, it comes down to honesty. Yeah. It's very clear when a student is speaking honestly about something.
Yeah.
How much you understand it or don't understand it, and why it's important to the project or why it's not important to the project. All of it, right? It's very, very clear. And when there's a little bit of dishonesty, I don't mean they're trying to be deceitful, but they're trying to, again, like, sound convincing, which you should want to sound convincing, but they want to sound like, I've learned this stuff and now I'm putting in this project. There's that threshold I think can feel as a presenter, like, I'm saying stuff, but I know for realsies I don't really understand this, but it does have volume, so I'm going to say it. And that's where it gets difficult as an audience member. It's like, this is just weird.
And I don't want to be that jury who like goes hard at them on like, how is the Trump wall working, and you're not understanding, and actually focusing the critic on that, because that's not the point. Like, that's a different subject. But you also don't want to get the critics to go that route by doing that. So you kind of have to like dose it, and at least at least just, maybe talk about it very briefly and maybe extract one aspect of that sustainability, the sustainable technology that you thought was interesting that you can somehow implement in your project. But you don't have to dive into like the percentages and the studies and so studies. And unless it's a PhD project that is focused on that topic, then you probably have to. But
so on that last note, in a presentation, when you're tight on time, which you always are in these settings, you have to know what should be conveyed in your speech and what things should be conveyed after the fact during the Q&A, and what things should be conveyed via the boards, but you're not going to talk about them because they're on the boards. And so I think the science behind some of the things you mentioned, if it's part of the class, then you should do it. But whether or not you need to go into details, like maybe that's one of those things that would be covered during the question and answer portion of the presentation, or maybe that's covered in writing on the boards, and therefore you don't need to talk about it, because you also want to be very efficient with your time. You want to talk about the things that are the most important for the project, for you, for the class, et cetera, and you don't want to waste time on stuff that's not important. Yeah. And so I think that's how you would solve that. But talking about trom walls and other types of whatever label items, I think the other mistake people make is they just use terms that are terms, and it's kind of like, again, a checklist. It's like this term, that term, A, B, C, D, E, F, boom, 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 boom. And that's not very interesting nor convincing. And I think a better way to do it is to understand how those different mechanisms work, and then say, for example, because we're in this certain climate, I have a thick wall that has X, Y, and Z components of it, and the sun hits it, so it distributes, heat throughout the night. That is a trom wall. And that's a more effective way of describing to me why your project is good than saying, I have a trom wall, so it's good.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I have a trom wall, so therefore it does X, Y, and so it's good. Like, don't use the terms, like explain how it works instead, but explain it as part of the story, not as a dictionary. Trom wall means this,
And the worst part is when students start reading stuff, because most of them are not good readers.
Sure.
And if it's very dry information, nobody wants to hear that. So I mean, I don't want to hear somebody reading me about trom walls. I'm not interested. Send me the link and I do it on my own. Yeah. I'll do that after. I don't want to be present for that. And don't read your presentation either, especially if you're just glancing at it and it's more like, little notes and keywords and you're reading, but you're really making the sentences as you speak. That's really how the presentation should go if you need some kind of paper physical support of your, verbal presentation, if you can't just like do it from memory. But the worst is just, when you put out the print and you just read it, and a lot of the time it's kind of awkward too, because you're actually judging the writing of the person as they're reading it.
Sure.
And it's like, people have different styles. Some are more like casual, some are like very formal, some are very
quiet.
And it's like, and if you ask them to repeat, 2 minutes later, like, oh, so what was your statement? They can't. They have to put that paper out again to look at it.
Yeah, that's not good.
And that's not good, because it means like, what, do you even know what your project is about?
Yeah.
So you have to practice. You have to make some flashcards with some keywords on it, like use some highlighters of different colors for different topics or whatever, but you can't read.
Well, I think I would take a slightly lesser stance on that. I agree with you, but I also would, from a teaching perspective, I'd rather have a student have note cards and read from them rather than having no note cards and just winging it if they don't know their stuff.
No, they're both bad.
They're both bad. So, being prepared, and if you're a junior student and you feel like you need to read as a crutch, then I don't do that. But if you do it, then you have to at least... You brought up a good point, too. The problem with reading is that then you get stuck in your mind gets stuck in a certain way of working, and then when it comes time to actually get feedback or expand on stuff, it's really difficult to do. Yeah, because you're in note card mode. You're not in conveying information and conversation mode.
I mean, look, if English is not your first language, and you know you can just like improvise, then that's one thing. But if it is, I think you should try and get away from that.
I want to go back to your point about the students presenting things as if they are final and perfect when you know that they're not. So the way I interpreted that is sort of like when the student is almost too confident in what they're saying.
Yeah, that could be that.
And it starts to sound like they're selling me Flex Seal or OxyClean or one of these like info commercial things. Like, this is the best thing. You're going to love it. I've changed the world.
I mean, hey,
you must act on this now. I've done all this research. I know it's the case. Want it. Buy it. Buy it.
Look,
and it's
I think that's
all right.
I think that's a skill to have that I'm sure at some point in their life, in their adult life, would be very good to have, because you need it. You know, sometimes you need it.
I
if
guess.
you don't have it. But if you put things in context, you know, and you look at who's the audience, who's the presenter, where are things happening, what is it about, you kind of have to like bring things back to their context a little bit. If the project is amazing, then hey, this is all, you know, that's perfect, that's great.
Yeah.
The project is not that great, but you get a speech like that, it might actually not help you in the end.
No, it doesn't.
You
it
know,
doesn't.
rather than being more neutral about the tone and the speech.
Yeah.
Because you're overselling a piece of crap.
Yeah,
That's basically what's happening. So that's not good.
No, it's not good. And I think it's problematic because, one, it gives that individual a false sense of reality. They think, and it's a weird thing also, just with human beings, the more you talk about something and the more confidently you talk about it, the more it becomes the truth.
Yeah.
That's just the way it works. So my biggest fear with students like that is when they're conducting themselves that way almost all the time, then there's a very good chance that their understanding of reality is quite distorted. You know what I mean?
And
I guess you could call it a hard sell versus a soft sell.
Yeah.
In terms of like how people speak. But I find I'm very turned off by that. I don't think it's productive. And I also think that when people speak that way, again, just from life experience, I know that there's a very, very, very high chance that they are not actually listening to anyone else in the world, including the critics. They're just doing their thing. And that, and you know, presentation issues aside, learning objectives aside, and all that stuff aside, that is very problematic. You cannot operate that way as a human being, especially if you're going to go on to be someone like an architect who has responsibility. You can't do that.
Well, it's very hard too for the critics to actually deliver critics because like this person is so amped up about what they're telling me. Now I have to be the one breaking their dream to make them realize that their project is shit.
I don't have a problem doing that.
Well, I don't feel good about doing that because, you know, they're obviously not aware of the situation.
No, but see, that's what I'm saying, though. Okay, so...
Oh, you think they are?
Sometimes they are not aware, but I think the people I'm thinking of, they are aware. They know they're doing it. They know they're polished. They know that they have it together, and they're using that as a shield to protect themselves from actual criticism, as a shield to make it look like their project is one way, but really it's not if you go behind the curtain, right? And again, human nature, people are convinced by people who speak confidently, who have good sales voice, who speak eloquently, who X, Y, and Z, right? That's the way it works. And all of that, again, it oftentimes ends up being a false facade. And it can be used as a weapon to convince people of false information.
Right.
And not to get political, but this is like a lot of the problem we have now.
Right.
And so when I see someone presenting that way, it really bothers me. It really bothers me. One, because again, you see the context, like, okay, come on. You didn't, cure cancer here. And even if you're claiming to have done, I know you didn't.
Well, it's maybe
a weird
bit
thing because
too
you need
much
to
ego going on.
Yeah.
Where really our profession should not be about ego in any ways.
And people listening might be thinking, well, this is weird because you have to at once speak with confidence and authority and sound like you know what you're talking about, but also not not past a certain point. Right? And I think that's the case. Again, hard sell versus soft sell. This is like two different strategies, right?
Yeah.
I think hard selling can work, but in a learning environment, no, come on. What are you doing? Like, you don't need to do that.
There's another thing I notice quite often with students is the use of pronouns, or however you call it. Yeah. No, well, there's two things. There's the use of the word my.
Okay.
My building, my site, my project. I understand. My project, fine. I could let that pass.
Okay.
My building, my site, my wall, my whatever. No. This is not yours. No, it's not. You would never, if you work in like the actual, the field of architecture and you have clients, you never go to your clients, present their project and be like, so this is my site plan. No, it's not your site plan. It's my property. I'm paying you for it.
Right.
It's mine.
It's the site.
It's the site. It's the document that is between you and I. It's no one's, right? It's kind of a tricky thing because you are the author of it.
Yeah.
So technically it is yours, but I don't think you need to manifest, as millennials will say, that it's mine. You know what I mean? Like there is also this weird thing when you say the word mine or my, that it's yours and you're kind of like holding on it, versus if it's a shared thing. It's no one's, it's everyone's. And that's not something I very, very much have a hard time with. Also because I found it very immature. I could picture a kid in kindergarten holding a toy and being, that's my toy. Right. Meaning it's not yours, it's not theirs, it's my toy. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, that kid hasn't seen the world yet.
Yeah.
But like when you're a college student, like I find it weird.
Well, I think that's...
I don't know if it's just me, but...
No, but I think the...
And then you find... And I saw that sometimes in at an office working. And that just was a turn off for me. I'm like, I could never be your friend. This is never going to happen. Don't know who you are. This is definitely not your building here.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm trying to think in the professional settings now or previously, or even when I was a student, if I would have said the word my or mine. I probably did, but I know now for sure, especially when you're talking to a client, you don't use the word my, because it doesn't make sense at all, because it's not your building, it's not your wall, it's not your anything, the only thing that's yours is the drawings
and the physical model. And
yeah,
that's
the physical model. But I like the point you brought up, though, that when you use certain words which would seem innocuous, they actually they inform how you think about whatever the subject is. So when you use the word my site, my building, it seems to make sense, and again seems harmless, but is a conceptual shift. Yeah. It's very different from the building, the site, the community's building. It's a very, very different shift. And I do think that when people use the word my or mine in the way you're describing, it also can be used as a shield to protect themselves against criticism. Because it's like, well, you have your feedback and your ideas, but this is what I did.
Yeah.
And I did it this way because I wanted it this way, and it's mine. And so you can give me feedback, but it's mine. Yeah. So what do I care? And now, that doesn't mean that all the students
like an artist would say, it's my painting, it's my sculpture.
Right, exactly. And it's not to say that all students who use the terms my and mine are thinking that way, but I think your point is that, again, subconsciously, it can bleed back to how you think about the thing. Yeah. And if you do think about this site plan you've created as being for and part of the community, well, that could potentially poke a lot of holes into the design decisions you've made. Yeah. Because it's no longer there's a little bit about like self-justification, because I want it, I did it, and therefore it is. Yeah. And therefore it's good. Yeah. And you don't want to allow any of that thinking to bleed into a project. Now
I'm going to bring another one around.
Okay.
The other one that also throws me off, maybe not in the same way, is when students say we instead of I. Like for the project, okay. I thought this and I did that. it makes sense. Like you're the person behind the work, so you can use I because it is you.
Sure.
But when students start saying we did this and we decided the project should be that, and I'm like, who's we?
Right.
I'm like, this is an individual project. It's not a group project, right? And it's a different project than the previous person and the next person. So it's definitely your project.
I don't remember anyone in this last round saying we.
Yeah.
Oh,
there
really?
is a we around, and it threw me off because I was like, what, do you have a partner? Do you have an office? Who else was on it?
Yeah.
I was curious, which is, it's kind of the opposite, is like wanting to be maybe too inclusive, that you're speaking for the community and therefore saying we as you describe the work that you've done on the project, which I think is great because you're not thinking about yourself, you're thinking about the community. But it's also a bit weird if maybe you're not in the community you're designing for. Like you don't want to, there is a fine line between all those things, right?
And I think maybe it could sound like we're nitpicking, and this is this part of the conversation is maybe a kind of higher level of presentation criticism. But I think it's really important because how you talk about things does inform how you think about it. It also informs how people perceive the project. So I do like the idea of always approaching the project as this object that's sitting on a table between the two of us, and we're just going to talk about the object, right? And yes, I made decisions about it. So yeah, I thought that this would be a good idea, so that's why I made this alteration to the thing. But it's still this thing that's out there in the world that objectively doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the amorphous community. And we can talk about it that way in a more collaborative sense. I think also that this last bit of how you speak about the project is a soft way to invite criticism and invite feedback and invite collaboration and conversation. And it's subtle, but it does make a really big difference, even if the audience is not aware of it. It all of these things add up. And I do think a presentation, really, you want to think about it as an active collaboration session, in a sense. It's a challenging thing. Again, you want to put out, but also receive.
Yeah.
And the way you speak can suggest that you are one mode or the other, or both.
Yeah. Another thing that I've noticed that I think maybe students don't think about as much as a way to make the project more personable and maybe more interesting to the critics. Some students, they just find a concept and they go with the project and it's great, like everything makes sense. Some others, it's more of a struggle because they can't get to those big ideas quicker, or they can get to them at all. And like you mentioned before, I think you said sometimes there is like one thing in the presentation that they just kind of like run through very quickly. That's the most interesting part.
Yeah.
And I found like a lot of the students who maybe have more struggles during final presentations are the ones that have that. They have something that's kind of like, a little blip in their speech that was super. That was a nugget of very specific project that seemed that could have been dived deeper for them.
Yeah.
And a lot of time I found that it's when it's something that's more personal to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that like I said, there is students that are very rational and they're very successful at designing by being rational, and there is students that maybe have more struggles, and those might be some that have more of an emotional response to projects.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it's very hard for these students that have more of an emotional response to create because they look, at the table next to them with the person who's more rational, and they just like fly through stuff and it seems easy. And for them, it's a lot more struggle. They think about the project in a lot of very different ways. That's very hard to put on paper and transform into a building. Mm-hmm. In the same time, I think those projects are oftentimes the most special and interesting because they come from a much deeper place than, just rational. And I think that's kind of like maybe a tip for students who feel like they're stuck in their project or their presentations. Like, go back to your guts, go back to what feels right and what drives you and what doesn't. And there is some answers in there.
Yeah, I agree. The reality is that actually a big part of being an architect or designer is knowing how to unpack, dissect, and understand your instincts, right? By the time you get to architecture school, you've lived enough. You haven't lived a lot, but you lived enough to have some kind of identity, some kind of instinct. You grew up somewhere. You've had experiences. You've experienced life, and I think architecture is an intimidating thing to outsiders and to students because they perceive it as being kind of a blank page.
Yeah.
It's a blank page with all of these different things you're supposed to put on it. You're like, well, what? Like,
Yeah.
where do I put it in the corner? I guess I don't know. Do I make it round, square? I don't know. And there's a lot of different ways to kind of solve that fear, but one of them. But I think that's a wrong way to view it, right? First of all, there's always a bunch of information that the project gives you, the site gives you, that informs things. But you're not a blank piece of paper. You're not a emotionless, soulless paintbrush. You are a person with ideas and feelings and instincts. So you probably have an instinct when you're talking about a program and a site of like, well, I feel like this would make sense. Okay. Figure out why you feel that way.
Yeah.
And it might be wrong. Doesn't matter. The point is now you're learning how to think like a designer. You're learning how to take instincts and you're learning how to take information that's very vague and confusing and weird and make it into something real and then critique it and then put it next to other information and see if it works with that. And now things are moving. That's also why I think what you said goes back to an earlier point I made of when you have an idea, you have to write it down. You have to express it in some physical way. Ideally, since we're architects, you should put it down in drawing or in model making, but in something and have it be there. And then you will learn from it. And then that will allow you to expand on it, And so I do find also that a large part of being an architect is taking those instincts and those ideas and knowing how to just show them in some way, to spatialize them, to architecturalize them.
I think also it's a good training for, later if you do work with clients directly, because you will have to do that with the ideas that comes from them.
Mm-hmm.
You have to analyze them and understand them from a place that's not always rational, right? And you have to get comfortable doing that.
I mean, that really is a huge part of the skill set of an architect is taking that information and making it into something real.
Yeah.
Writers do it through writing, architects do it through form, space, material, light, tectonics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's our language. And so you just can't sit with your ideas. You have to do something with them. But I do like your point though, when people are stuck, it's like, well, just look inward.
And if there is nothing inward because you're like an emotionless piece of wood, you could also look back at the site.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it always amazed me. And you're right. And I don't know, maybe it's something they need to say in school when students start. It's like, nothing is blank. We don't create from zero because, like you said, we each come with a background. We each build in a place that has things around it. Like, we're never starting from nothing.
Yeah.
Right? And I understand that, architects are not urban designers, urban planners, or, all of those like bigger city planning people. But still, like, there is people across the street from the site you're going to build on. There's people next to the property you're going to be building on, right? There is a sky and trees around, and what's in the dirt below. There is like
There's
all
a
of
lot
those
of
four
things.
dimensions.
Yeah.
There is a lot of information that could be extracted one way or the other. And it doesn't have to be analyzed very deeply. It could just be kind of like the surface layer, but it's always a good place to go back to validate ideas or understand. Or, one of the things we saw to our review is like, how do students decide to locate a building on their plot of land, on their site? A lot of it seems arbitrary to me.
Yeah.
When, looking back in my days in school, and, French people do it differently, I get that. Like, there is always a reason to put it one place or the other.
Yeah.
And it's never because that's what you've decided. It's basically what everything else is dictating around for you to put the building where it should be.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of a it's kind of a sad thing because it's maybe too rational to the point where it doesn't always make the most sense. But you can't ignore.
This really gets to design itself. I mean, there is, I think, when the way of designing and that process becomes too rational, then you end up in places that are kind of like the most boring solutions, or they're not best solutions because you're missing something that's a little bit more outside of the box. But I would agree that generally in a lot of schools in the United States, the way that the thinking occurs to locate a building is more to do with internal decisions rather than external factors, which you want it to be both. That's what it should be. So another easy mistake to mention that students make incredibly often is that when they have a site, a property, and their building is going to go on that property, and they have a site plan, it's of that site, but they don't have any drawing of what's around the site. And it's mental. It's like that's crazy. Like if your plot of land is square and it's 100 by 100 and you have a building on it, I have no idea whether or not the location, size, shape, material, or anything about the building is valid or completely wrong because I don't know what's around it.
Yeah.
Is there a park next to you? Is it an empty parking lot? Is there trees? Is it a forest? Are there mountains? Is there
a 100-foot tall wall?
Is there like a big tower? Like what are we doing? Are there grocery stores? Is there an art gallery, a kindergarten, a prison? Like what is next to you, right?
Yeah.
It's like designing a room but not having any idea of what room goes next to it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. You can't do that. So I don't know why architects tend to be in this box, but
But it's weird, and also it's like I think there is also more possibilities if you think about it in a broader way. I mean, like there is the city, there is the streets, there is the blocks, and then there is the individual lot, right? Nothing says that you cannot invent a different type of lot by the way you put your building on the piece of property.
Yeah.
Like there's been architects who've done actually thought about a city block and how you can, put buildings on it and split it and create circulation, internal pathway, pedestrian, walkways and all of those things. That doesn't mean you can't do that on a small property size as well.
Sure.
So there is this idea that the two are maybe too divorced or architects don't, something that always pisses me off, that architects don't design the streets, they only design buildings. And I'm like, okay, fine, what is the street made of? Buildings. All right, then.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, the streets are residual from the architecture.
It's kind of silly. But yeah, so I think if you're stuck there, it's kind of a couple routes that you can look into to unstuck yourself in a project.
And by the way, too, because if a project is unsuccessful at that, we'll call it larger scale, then it's unsuccessful, period, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a hierarchy to architecture and design. And if you don't get the basics right at the big gestures, then who cares about whatever material you're using or this and that?
Yeah.
It's you've screwed up everything else around it.
Who cares about the Trump wall? If there is a lot of shadow and a lot of sunlight,
yeah, exactly,
or a forest, it won't work.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I guess in that case, the mistake is sort of not thinking big picture enough in a sense.
Well, it goes back to the process of thinking, which again, I don't know how school approach that or not, but going from the really, really big idea to the smaller one, going from the city scale to the doorknob scale, right? Zooming in and out. And it's constantly, it doesn't mean that step one is you look at the city, step two is you do that. No, you go back and forth because everything inform every decision in different ways. It kind of sounds like a lot. How do you even make anything then if it goes that way? But it truly is, and it informs it on different point of view, not on everything. So,
I do want to also talk about. You said the site is a wealth of information.
Yeah,
and you just have to look for it. So for some reason, it kind of reminded me that. So when you're a little kid, or when I was a little kid, when you think of the forest and you take an aerial view of a forest, you just see a bunch of trees. There's a bunch of broccoli, just trees, right? And then I talk about this because I think in fourth grade we learned about the rainforest, but then when you learn about the rainforest, you're like, oh my God, There's like thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of species of things living in the forest, and it's incredibly loud. And there's things living below the surface, and the next level of surface, and on the surface, and then you have this. There's all these layers to the trees, and there's life at every single layer of all different kinds, and it's incredibly intense and rich. But prior to actually looking and paying attention, you just assume, well, it's a forest, there's trees, just a bunch of trees. And I think the same thing happens with students and adults looking at any site. It's like, oh, just a site. There's just a normal site with a road and a sidewalk and whatever. Just normal suburban things or normal whatever place. It's like, no, you need to look more closely. So I think the other thing too is really the first step to being an architect is knowing how to look and listen. That's really it. If you don't know how to look at stuff, you don't know how to listen, you're not going to be a good architect.
Yeah. Well, and maybe for I don't know, like California students, it goes back to maybe not walking around as much. Like, I don't know how much you can experience and understand from driving places.
Yeah. I
mean, I'm just again thinking back about my days in school, like living in Paris, and we would get an assignment where, well, it's like this site that doesn't look like anything exciting, and we go and spend like 4 hours walking around, taking notes, taking pictures, just basically scavenger hunting for stuff that could be meaningful to come back to. Basically we're there to collect information, dig and find and collect information that we think is special or could be used in some way for the project. And I don't know that students do that very much in the US.
Less so
in general.
The schools tend to be more focused on the building itself, form, tectonics, space, like all that kind of stuff, which is important to learn. But
even going and like asking pedestrian questions in the street, like it's not the most fun exercise, and it sounds like, well, what are you getting or whatever. But actually talking to people about like the most basic things you learn in school and finding their opinion about it, if you don't want to be reading a bunch of books to understand the place and what it is to live in a place, why you just ask people who live in the place what it's like. That's the best testament of what it is. It's not romanticized. It's not polarized. It's just like from the person who's there.
Right. The other thing I wrote down is...
if I had students, they would be working so hard.
Why do you say that?
Because I would make them do all kinds of things. And then they would never finish their project.
Well, it's a funny thing with this last part, because there's these two different kind of skill sets. One, you have to have the skills to actually produce the thing, which is the building, and that requires skill. You have to have the skill of like learning how to ask questions, look at stuff, learn things, listen, like we were talking about. And you need both. And it's hard to learn, but both are really difficult to learn.
And studio is not a place when you learn everything. Like the other classes outside of studio should be teaching you some of those things.
Yeah, sure. Well, depending on the school, yeah.
The last thing I think for me, it's pretty appropriate, is the ending of a presentation. It's kind of an awkward thing, and I feel like a lot of students don't really know how to end. It's either they stop talking and there is like a 10-second silence and then we're understood that was the end of the presentation, or they're kind of like rush through things and then they're like, okay, I think I'm done. Yeah, I think I'm done. Oh, one more thing. Oh, okay, now I'm done. And it's like, okay. Some others like do a better job at wrapping it up and be like, do you guys have any questions? And then that just kind of suggests that's the end. But it's always kind of an awkward, how do you end your project presentation?
Yeah.
You can start giving cookies, like you have to turn on the music.
You throw candy at people like Michael Scott. No, it's a good point. I mean, it's funny you say that, because that's probably the last thing that anyone thinks about when they're giving a presentation, especially students, because it's like if I can just get my stuff printed and pinned up, it's a win, And if I said
everything I had to say, so get me
exactly.
out of here.
Exactly, but it is good to have an ending, or I'll be honest, when I was a student, I never planned to have an ending, or at the very least, you should know when you're done talking. It might not be an ending, but you should know, like, that's it, I'm done. Now it's your turn.
Yeah.
But what you should you really should not be in a case where like, I think that's everything, because then it's like, okay, you really don't know. Okay, look, as a critic in an academic setting, there's 1,000 things that I could say about a project, about any project. And I'm trying, and all the jury members are trying to decide based on you, if they're good jury members or critics, based on you, the person, the student, you as an individual, what should I say to help you? Should I talk about the site? Should I talk about the graphics? Should I talk about the building, the materials, the presentation? Should I talk about the culture? Should I talk about whatever? And I will choose what to say based on who you are and what you say. And so it's kind of like when you're a student and you're like, I think that's it. Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Now my brain goes to, okay, I think we need to talk more about process and kind of like kindergarten stuff rather than the project, because clearly you need help just being structured in how you work and scheduling and calendars and whatever else, right? I don't always do that, but yeah, you should have an ending. The other thing, and I mentioned this to the students in this case, that a big mistake students make is that they don't listen to their other classmates' presentations.
Some of them did last time.
Oh, no.
And they picked up on stuff, and I was like, okay, I appreciate that, you're not repeating that, and you actually like...
Yeah. Of course, some do, but a lot don't. And look, I get it. There's a lot of the stuff of like, I've been up all night. I can barely be awake. I'm not paying attention to this guy because I think he's a dick and I don't care about his project. There's a lot of that, right? And that's fair. But it's not so much actually about listening to their presentations. It's more about listening to the critics. Because again, the critics, we intentionally say different things spread across 22 students or 12 students or whatever it is. Because I'm not going to want to repeat myself. And I want you, if you're listening, to learn different things. So, in this case, it was like 22 students, which is like a lot. Over the course of 22 students, and I don't know how many minutes of raw feedback from 3 different people, that's a whole quarter of information, a whole semester of information packed into, 5 hours or however long it lasted. Yeah. It's a lot. So that's a huge mistake students make, is not listening throughout all the presentations. Again, that assumes that the critics are decent. I mean, I've been I've been a student, and we've had critics. I'm like, this person is just a fucking waste of space. Sounds so terrible, but I'm like, so anecdotally, right? I had this one project. I think it was 3rd year, and it was an art gallery building, and so this was like a mid review, so things were not fleshed out whatsoever, but I had this idea for panels that would kind of rotate around in the space and whatever. It was based on a grid and this and that.
I feel like you always do that.
And I had,
I feel like you always do grids and rotating stuff.
Well, I do have a fascination with things that not just move, but they can become different. Anyway, we'll get into another recording. But I had this model, and the model had a series of wire rods that stuck up. So the model itself was very small. It was maybe like 4x4. And these very thin wire rods were placed on a grid that would maybe like a centimeter between them. Just a field of rods. And a little tiny person who was like maybe half an inch tall in there. And it was just a spatial experimental model that was talking about space and how you experience space and what it meant to be in a field of things around you. And that was one of many models that I had. And this one critic, who was a teacher at the school, his only thing to say was, he picked up the model and goes, wow, that's interesting. So I think you could like comb your hair with it. And that was the extent of his feedback. So I do understand as a student, sometimes your attitude is not like I'm describing, because you are dealt a shit hand of critics, and it's amazing how many bad ones there are. But nevertheless, if you can just turn off your brain for that one person and pretend they don't exist in the universe and just pay attention to everyone else, it can be very beneficial. I'll never forget that. Even the teacher was like, seriously? Like, what are you doing? Like, I invited you to be a critic for my students, and this is your feedback. It's not even feedback.
That's pretty terrible.
The very last thing I want to talk about is how you respond to the feedback you're getting.
Right. That's a good one.
And I think one of the biggest mistakes a student can make is not actually listen to the feedback being given. It doesn't happen often. I think most students are good people and they want to learn and they're interested in hearing the feedback. But on occasion, there are students who, even if the feedback is good, they don't really care what that person has to say. And I've been at critiques where sometimes a student gets very aggressive, which is just rude. And other times, there's this thing that certain people do, not just students, where when someone is giving them information, feedback or just information, their way of responding is, yeah, and they speak with they give affirmation. They go, yeah, oh yeah, and they do it too much, and it's like, stop. I've given you a minute of information, and you said, yeah, like 6 times. And maybe it's a pet peeve. There might be more
issues behind that.
No, but the thing is, here's the thing. For some folks, it sounds like, wow, that person's really engaged. They're listening because they're agreeing. But if you actually understand people, it's much more likely that they're not listening. And they are doing that because they know that it has an effect of making it seem like they're listening.
Yeah.
And they are positive, and they're on top of their stuff, and they're polished, and they're mature, and all these things. But in reality, you are not listening. Because a person who is actually listening to what you're saying, and they are engaged by it, they're not vocalizing a yes or a no. They're thinking. And you can see it on their face that they're thinking. And the only thing you'll hear most of the time is a or like kind of puzzled, like, why is that the case? But you will not hear no, and you will not hear a yeah. If it's a yes or a no, you're not listening. You're not actually listening to what I'm saying. And in the case of feedbacks of presentations and school projects and architecture, presumably the feedback that's being given is like insightful things that you should be really, really listening to very closely, much more closely than students understand. So that's a very small point, but it's a huge turnoff in the school space, but also just when I'm talking with people, when they're doing that, I'm like, listen, stop. Slow down, just be in the moment and listen to the things that I'm saying so we can have a conversation. If you disagree with it, that's fine. Let's have a conversation. But
is it fine?
I'm talking to a wall right now.
Yeah.
That's pretending to be this like superhero person. And it's, again, it goes back to, something I was saying earlier about kind of being falsely confident,
Yeah. Another thing too, as a way to react to the critics is to ask questions.
Yeah.
Sometimes critics would say things that might not be very clear because, some of those thoughts could be very abstract, or maybe they're using a word you've never heard before, right? Well, don't be shy to ask. Again, you're even if you're not a student, like, don't be afraid to ask, Like, you have to understand what people are saying, especially if it's about your work. Otherwise, what's the point of the conversation?
Yeah,
It's just jibber jabber.
No, I think that's true, and also from a critic's perspective, you don't like when that happens, and when you can tell, because the reality is also these things take a lot of time, and even if we want to be there, there's like 100 other things I should be doing or could be doing, and the worst feeling that a critic can have is that that their time is being wasted. And the time feels wasted only when what they're saying is not being received, either because of misunderstandings or, again, they're closed off mentally, like I was saying. So you really...
Or if there is specific feedbacks on things that you did not get from them, well, ask them question, what do you think of this thing?
Yeah.
What's your take on it? So you feel like you've learned as much as you could from that experience.
Because that's really what we want. If the critics are there for the right purpose, we want to just help.
Yeah.
And if we get the sense that we're not being helpful, then it just sucks.
Sucks.
Okay. Anything else?
That's it.
All right,
That's it.
cool.
I mean, overall, all in all, like the students we saw last week did a lot of work.
Oh yeah, a lot of
if
what I had to say was not
and if
about
they did
them.
listen to this episode, like I mean, this is like really like trying to be like way better at the next presentation. But
I guess.
but it's some of it is basic and some of it, if it's just a small part of your presentation that you can improve on, then it's not a big deal. But if like most of your presentation is one of the points we talked about today, and it could really beneficiate from that, then maybe it's something to work on.
Sure. That's it. Okay.
Or if we're coming to your school next to creating your project, then you better do that.
Well, the way I was going to kind of package it was that most of what I had to say was just general information anyway, not necessarily based on any one particular person or class.
No, it is. It is.
Okay, give us an outro.
Thanks everyone for listening to this episode. If you like the show, please support us by following us on social media, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and everywhere else where you listen to your podcast. And of course, leave us a review. It's always appreciated.
Yeah.
We also are on Instagram quite a bit, so you can follow Second Studio Pod there. We have the website, secondstudiopod.com, with all of the episodes, transcript, little photos, whatever. Go on there, check it out.
And we have a hotline. So it's a phone number that you can text or leave a voicemail if you have questions, guest suggestions, et cetera. And that number is 213-222-6950. So shoot a text and then maybe we'll reply on the show.
Maybe not.
Could be good.
Yeah, it could be good.
Okay, that's it. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.